Good morning. Not only is it Friday again, but it is a new month. So let's take a moment to celebrate the beginning of May. Remember, all of this was supposed to be done by now. So the fact that we're still in the beginning part of the reconciliation process is a huge victory. And there has been a ton of stuff that has happened this week. We're kind of entering a period where we've been running a marathon and now we're going to have to do some sprinting. So let's get into what has been happening. Um, just a few little, starting the webinar with some of the good things that have happened this week. There's been some great coverage of additional professional organizations that are taking a much more public position on what Medicaid cuts would mean for them. And we've gotten a few questions in our office and from other places about people who are very interested in what's happening with Medicaid. Maybe they help people who are on Medicaid or are reimbursed for their health or long-term care or other services through Medicaid. And sometimes people are really worried about, well, if I say anything at all or express an opinion, is that lobbying? And so I wanted to go through and say, now is the time to add your voice to the conversation and show you a few examples of professional groups that have been doing that. There was a physicians group that held a press conference and got some coverage. And everybody should know that no matter what you do for your job, you are a constituent. You have 2 U.S. senators and a U.S. representative in Congress who represent your state or your area within your state, and they represent you. And so every person is a constituent, no matter where you work, no matter, what your opinions are, or, what who you serve, you are always a constituent. And every constituent can contact their elected officials and say their experience, your professional experience, and the people you work with are part of the story that you can share. And you have a really valuable perspective in terms of thinking about what policy decisions Congress is considering and what that might mean for your clients or your small business or who you choose to take as a client or not. That is all perfectly fine to share as a constituent. Providing your perspective is actually very helpful to lawmakers, and it helps educate them about the people in their area and their experience and what the policies that they're considering in Congress might do to the people they're supposed to represent. So you should feel really confident that contacting your lawmaker as a constituent, as an individual, and asking them to do or not do or take a position or ask their position on something that is of concern to you, that is a role for a concerned constituent. That is a role that our government expects every person who is a constituent to play. It's supposed to be how our democracy works. So, you should not feel like you need to censor or silence yourself simply because the work you do is partially funded or supported by some of the dollars that Congress is considering cutting, including Medicaid, but also other pots of funding as well. And I think that the lobbying question, when you're acting as yourself, as a concerned constituent, you are not lobbying on behalf of an organization. So you should feel like that is something that you can do. And you may not want to do it on work time, right? Like there may be policies that individual businesses have in place to make sure you stay focused on the job you're hired to do. But what you do on your own time is up to you. And certainly, we also have been encouraging, there's lots of people who are small businesses who provide health or long-term care who have been on these webinars, they certainly have a role to talk about the impact of what federal funding cuts would do to their small business. And that is also within the realm of constituent education. Now, if you're a trade organization that is representing the interests of many different businesses or people, then yes, you might be lobbying, which is also a role that those groups play. So just an example here of one professional group that's taking a more public position on Medicaid cuts in particular, and an encouragement for those of you who are connected to professional organizations that this is really a time to start adding these kinds of voices more publicly to this debate. Another really nice example this week of somebody who kind of leveraged her professional experience and a long historical perspective into a really nice op-ed. Sheboygan Press had an op-ed that had a person who knew a lot about special education and Medicaid and really did a great job tying together how those two things are related. How, students with disabilities who are who have also have medical needs, that these two things intersect and support people who have pretty significant needs. Some of you have been taking your advocacy. Many of you have been writing local op-eds to your local papers, which is great. Continue to do that. Lots of them are getting published. But here's somebody who got it into a national paper. So, don't be shy if you have opinions. This one was not about Medicaid in specific, but some of the comments which we've discussed in previous webinars that the Secretary of Health and Human Services has made about autism. That is also a great avenue. Like if you, oftentimes national publications will want to feature a variety of opinions from across the country. So, if you've done your local op-eds, feel free to look at some of the more national media outlets or contact some of the independent journalism that is kind of cropping up all over the place too. Those folks are often looking for perspectives as well. This week, Monday and Tuesday, which feels a lot more than like 3 or 4 days ago, Joint Finance held their last 2 hearings on the state budget. This is one of the articles that was published after that hearing. If you missed the hearing or you want to revisit the experience, Wisconsin now has the all of the hearings that happened across the state, all 4 of them, archived on their website. So you could sign up for a free account and, listen to 8 hours, watch and listen to 8 hours of testimony at your leisure. Maybe when you're out in the backyard or gardening or doing a barbecue or something. Tons of people came out for these hearings, and a lot of people were talking about Medicaid and special education, food assistance, public transportation. The 2 issues I heard most about were Medicaid and public and special education. So that's all you guys. That's all constituents, real people who are coming out to talk about things they care about. And I was just in the legislature yesterday, kind of going around to some joint finance offices, and multiple offices talked about how much it makes a difference to hear from real people. A lot of them talked about how important it was to hear what the actual things that normal people have to say. And it really does make an impression with the Finance Committee about what are the things that they need to keep in mind, especially if they hear them over and over and across all 4 hearings. So good job. You guys made a big impression on many joint finance members, and that's fresh from yesterday afternoon for me. The other big thing, we'll spend a little time on this week, is that DHS, our friends at Wisconsin DHS, released a model that took a look at some of the proposals that have been talked about a lot in terms of ideas on how Congress might um, cut Medicaid, and they picked out three of them to do a little bit of modeling to say, okay, what would it mean if this idea actually came to Wisconsin and was implemented? And some of these ideas, they made some assumptions and based their model on, proposals that have been introduced in the past, um, or things that they know. For example, they know how much Medicaid administrative match they receive and what that pays for. And so they can calculate if you got less money from the federal government for match, what would that mean? So they did three models and three proposals, and we'll go through what they found. But I think for those of you who have friends in other states or are from other states, I will tell you that this makes a huge difference. The Department of Health Services, this is the first time they've kind of come out publicly and said, hey, there are consequences to some of the ideas that Congress is considering for Wisconsin. And here's our estimate without knowing anything else about what it would mean. And it's the first time this, an independent state agency has said that. Extremely powerful. DHS did an actual press conference, which was well attended, and they got a ton of press coverage this week about this particular model. So while it doesn't cover every idea that could be out there for how to cut Medicaid, and it has to make some assumptions because we haven't seen any details, it does give a very clear picture that these cuts have major consequences, and they are things that the state really would need to do a lot of adjusting on if they were to happen. So for your friends in other states, one thing that you could suggest to them is point them to what our Wisconsin Medicaid director has done and say, look, this is something that every state could do, and every Medicaid director could be saying a lot more publicly their concerns about what it would mean for their state. I think now that we have a little bit of breathing time, it's a really critical point for states to start to be more public about what these kinds of changes could mean for the people who live within the borders. So the first of three estimates that our Wisconsin DHS did was to think about what would implementing a per capita cap mean in Wisconsin. And remember, this was an idea that was actually proposed in 2017. So there are some real, there is legislative language that ended up not passing that you can look at to say, okay, what were the ways that they thought about doing that per capita cap? And remember, a per capita cap kind of sets a fixed amount of federal money that can be spent per person. And that means that if you're a person whose costs are more than the fixed amount that has been given for your care, either the state has to pay up the difference, or you just get the amount of care that the money will buy, and then you either don't get care or somebody else has to pay for it. So we've talked about per capita caps because it is one of the most impactful kinds of cuts that you could make, especially as healthcare and long-term care costs go up over time. So that fixed amount, if it stays the same and costs go up, it tends to mean that the cuts deepen over time because the amount of money that you get for your care doesn't buy you as much. And DHS said, well, depending on the parameters, and they kind of gave three different scenarios within their estimates, a per capita cap would cost the state 6.4 to 16.8 billion over 10 years, depending how the bill is worded. So that's pretty impactful. They also looked at what would it mean if we had to make sure that everybody in Medicaid was either proved that they were working in order to keep their health care or had to prove that they were exempt from working in order to keep their health care. Um, Generally, that means a lot more paperwork because you have to think about, well, how often do people have to prove that they're working? And you know, is it monthly? Is it every other month? I mean, there are different factors, but the reality is that you have to have a process in place and people who are in charge of that process and who are looking at the information and verifying it and not making any mistakes in order to um, say, yep, you can continue to be in Medicaid. Now, there are mistakes that can happen on the state agency side. Somebody checks the wrong box or doesn't see something or whatnot. And of course, there are also paperwork mistakes that can happen on the side of the person who's trying to prove that they're either working or exempt. So most people understand that when you put in these kinds of extra paperwork processes, it does result in people losing their coverage, either through mistakes at an agency level or through, missed deadlines or their own mistakes. So DHS looked at just the part of it of, okay, if we had to do a process as a state agency, if we had to implement more work to prove either people are working already or they're exempt for work, what would that mean just as a state agency in terms of the money you need to have the people in order to do the job? And there is a model for this because there are work requirements in um, the food share program. They're called FSET. So they modeled the work requirements, based on what they already do. And that figured out that not only would it cost about $66 million per year to do that extra work, they estimated it would cost about 52,000 people their coverage, that's the amount of people they thought would not be able to make the paperwork requirements happen on time, and or you know have some mistake cost them their coverage. The other third thing they looked at was, okay, what would it mean, we as a state agency get federal dollars to help us run our Wisconsin Medicaid programs well. And that is called administrative match. So the federal government gives a percentage of money to states. It is 75% of the cost of running their Medicaid programs, and then the state contributes the remaining 25%. There is a proposal that would reduce the amount of money the federal government gives to states to help run their Medicaid programs well and conform to all of the federal requirements that states have to do to prove they're running their programs well. And that proposal is to reduce the amount of match from 75% to 50%. So DHS estimated what would that mean? And if the federal government reduced the amount of federal administrative match, that would mean that Wisconsin would have to pay $93 million per year more to do the same work. So in other words, reducing the federal amount of money means that you have to increase the amount of money the state is putting in, and it doesn't lead to a more care for more people. It leads to more cost for the state to do the same work that it's doing now. So those were the three things that that DHS estimated. There's obviously lots more changes, but you can share that study around with folks. We have heard from a couple of constituents this week where they are getting responses from their members of Congress who are saying to them, well, you know, all these concerns about Medicaid cuts are from outside organizations that are fear-mongering. And fear-mongering is a quote from the response to constituents. DHS isn't fear-mongering. DHS is looking at what Congress is publicly saying that it is considering doing and analyzing what would that mean if they did it. Um, that is that is a thing that you can point to, as well as all of the other studies that we've covered in other points of time. I don't think it's quite fair for members of Congress to say that outside groups are fear-mongering. Sometimes I've heard people accuse members of Congress of gaslighting, which is the opposite of fear-mongering, where somebody insists that something that is happening is not happening. And I worry a little bit that the message of that's going back to constituents is to say that, you know, all of your concerns are not real, when we do have a lot of people who are looking at these proposals and saying, okay, even though we don't know all of the details, we know enough about what you keep talking about and considering to be able to assess what it would mean for the state. And it does have an impact. Another option for those of you who are following kind of independent blogs or independent journalism sources or other things, here's an example of somebody whose story was featured and published in a publication that is independent. This is also something that if you follow various people in outlets like Substack or Medium, I think is another one, it's worth reaching out to folks and pitching a story to them. So, these places have their own reach, and it's maybe a different reach than some of the other places that you've already reached out to. So it's worth exploring those connections. Okay, so what has Congress been doing? It's a lot. Big picture, there's multiple things going on. There are some administrative actions in the DOJ, kind of the extra, it's not a governmental agency, even though it has department in the name. The DOJ continues to make cuts and changes to federal agencies. We've been following some of those, and we have a few more updates today. We also have the 2025 continuing resolution, which passed in March. Lots of that money has not gone out to the places it's supposed to go yet. So that's a piece of the puzzle. We have reconciliation, which is primarily what we've been talking about in these webinars. That's the big one bill that is trying to find lots of federal spending cuts in order to pay for the 2017 tax cuts, and now several other tax ideas that would reduce revenue into the federal government. And there's also a couple other things that are on the horizon. We've talked about a potential rescissions bill, which is a proposal by the president to take back some of the money that Congress appropriated earlier, as well as a new budget proposal for the next year, which actually starts in October 1st for the federal government. They have a fiscal year that runs from October 1st to September 31st. So we have kind of all of these things going on at the same time. And while reconciliation is the biggest thing in the forefront, all of these other things are also happening and may have an impact on people with disabilities and the programs that they rely on. And here's just a little bit more about, all of these separate things that are kind of balls in the air at the same time. So where are we on reconciliation? The star hasn't moved very much in the last couple of months, which is good. The star is still in the same place. This week, we saw a number of House committees who were either assigned cuts or told you can spend more money, come have what are called markup hearings. And markup hearings are where just the members meet and talk about the language of the bill. It's really the first time you get to see what the proposal actually is for cuts or spending increases, depending on what the committee's been told to do. And it's the opportunity for members of the committee to offer amendments to that bill. So it isn't like a public hearing where people come in and they testify and they say what they think about the bill. It's the committee members sitting together and talking about the proposal, and committee members having an opportunity to want to change or offer amendments to the language. Very often you will find that amendments that are offered by the minority party, who have probably not been at this point, they have not probably seen the language of the bill, are often not adopted. In fact, I'm not sure any amendments offered by the minority party were adopted. But it is a public airing of what does the committee think is the right path to take for cuts. So we have, I think, 6 or 7 committees that went this week, and we were supposed to have a couple more committees go next week, and then the week of May 12th was supposed to be kind of the final committee, so that we would be set up for potentially the full House voting on all of the cut ideas put together in the same bill the week of the 19th. We'll go through the committees that acted this week and then talk about what did or didn't happen for next week. So this week we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 committees publicly say, here are our ideas to make cuts or increase spending. Next week, it was supposed to be the big committees, Energy and Commerce and Agriculture, the committees that had fairly large cuts and that also have had the most disagreement about what to cut, specifically on Medicaid and food share. They were supposed to go next week. And in fact, that's what we were told up through the afternoon of Wednesday. It seems, as of 4:45 yesterday evening, that they will not be going next week as planned, and that they're anticipating that they might go May 12th. So they kind of had a week to play with, and we said, well, it could be either week. The early part of this week, we were told absolutely these 2 committees are going next week. Now it seems like they may have to take a little more time. And a lot of what Congress is considering, I think this is a useful frame to think about. How is Congress thinking about cuts? These 5 questions are a really good frame in terms of how they may be weighing what to do. We've heard a lot about fraud, waste, and abuse in Medicaid and applied to individual people. And that idea of what does Congress consider waste, fraud, and abuse is important, because it makes a difference as to what kinds of changes they think are useful to address that perception of fraud, waste, and abuse. And it isn't only individuals. There's certainly lots of conversations that would apply to individual people, which we've talked about. Increasing the frequency of eligibility checks is an idea. So is trying to help have people prove that they are working in order to have health coverage. Those are both ideas that have been framed as ways to address fraud, waste, and abuse. And really, it isn't individual people who are getting any money. They don't get benefit. The benefit is they get health care. It isn't that they get a check, right? And we've talked about how individuals, there is a lot of process in place to make sure only people who are eligible are the people in Medicaid. And that extra paperwork requirements most often don't result in finding people who aren't complying with the rules. They more often result in extra work that causes people to lose coverage. But there are other ways to think about fraud, waste, and abuse. And Congress is also thinking about, okay, what are we allowing states or companies to do that we may not want to allow them to do anymore? Provider taxes is one idea that has been talked about a lot. And thinking about how you perceive what states and companies are currently doing and whether or not you think that is okay or should be changed is a big factor in trying to think about what changes are appropriate. We've also talked a lot about this idea of wanting to protect vulnerable populations and why that isn't going to work, because people with disabilities and others are in all of our Medicaid programs, and there really isn't a way to just target harm to one group and protect another group. But the idea of who's vulnerable is also a place where Congress is really doing some thinking. And certainly there's been some public statements about thinking about who's vulnerable, going back to who was originally allowed to be in Medicaid in 1965. Over 60 years, Medicaid has expanded who it thinks is vulnerable. And then in 2010, the Affordable Care Act made a very deliberate decision to cover more people, working adults, in Medicaid. And that law saw that low-wage workers, they saw low-wage workers as being vulnerable to being uninsured. And certainly there are a lot of people who don't earn a lot and don't have employer-sponsored insurance and aren't able to purchase private insurance even on the exchange. So you can see that different people may think about who's vulnerable in a much more expansive or restrictive way. And depending on how you think about who's vulnerable determines who's in and out of that protective circle. Congress is also thinking about, how much can we ask states to pay more? And does that, are there consequences to that? So shifting what states are required to do, or saying, hey, we will give you money, but only if you pay us more money, are two strategies that have been talked about. And that's important because Medicaid and food assistance, frankly, have been programs that have had a lot of federal support, partly under the idea that if you want consistency across all states, then the federal government has to guarantee some level of contribution that is equal across states. Many states have balanced budget requirements, which means they can't spend more than they take in. So if states have to do a lot more for programs that are supposed to be consistent across 50 states, not all states will prioritize the same things, and not all states have the same amount of money as others. So, when you think about, are we going to ask states to pay more and decrease the amount of federal spending that Congress does? That means that there may be places where Medicaid or food assistance looks a lot different, and it's already the case where states have a lot of flexibility to design Medicaid differently across states. So you're just adding to that kind of difference as you cross state lines about what Medicaid means. They're also thinking about what are the changes, like what's really an acceptable economic impact to my local area? Where, whom, right? when you make federal cuts of this scale, you're going to create winners and losers. And that question of who are the winners and who are the losers, and are we okay with who those winners and losers are, is a big factor in trying to figure out what cuts to do. There's also a lot of fiscal conservatives in the House who are really concerned about the deficit. They're concerned about the federal government spending more money than it's taking in. And there are lots of ideas that would reduce the amount of revenue the federal government's getting in. We started off with just the 2017 tax cuts, but now there have been more ideas that have been added that would reduce revenue further. The president has a couple of tax ideas that were not part of the original plan to just extend the 2017 tax cuts that would have huge revenue impacts. And there's another group of legislators who would like state and local taxes to be counted less. Altogether, all of a sudden you're looking at $9 trillion in lost revenue, and the reconciliation bill is making two trillion in cuts for a 4.5 billion or trillion dollar extension. So for folks who are really concerned about reducing deficits and feel like having a high deficit is a risk to the overall economy, this proposal is not reducing that deficit nearly to the degree that they would want. So what happened in these committees that went this week that told us what to do and what they wanted to do in terms of spending cuts? I'm only going to focus on a couple. The Education and Workforce Committee, we were focused on this committee because it oversees the U.S. Department of Education and a lot of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act funding, which includes things like DVR. Most of what the committee focused on was higher education and loan eligibility, which is a big part of what the U.S. Department of Education does. It also had some language that limit the authority of the federal agency to make rules and repeal of rules. So there were some that feels a little bit more like a policy change as opposed to actually something that's saving money. And we'll see if that ends up being acceptable to stay in. But our major concerns of, are you going to, is this the way that you might go after, special education funding? That doesn't appear here in this bill. We're hearing rumors that there may be another approach, but we don't see a huge impact from this committee on people with disabilities at this point. Here are three other committees, and I have a couple of things highlighted. Transportation we were watching because there are lots of federal transportation funds that impact public transit and other local grant programs that provide, equipment upgrades and other things for county transit programs. Those don't look like they are part of the proposal to make cuts. There's a lot of changes that would impact the Coast Guard and federal employees, as well as a requirement for states to collect registration fees on all different types of vehicles, much higher fees on electric only or hybrid vehicles, and then a $20 fee for all motor vehicles. And states are all supposed to do that collection work and then send that money to the federal highway fund. So it's highlighted here because some of the fiscal conservatives were not happy with this provision because they feel like their caucus is a small government caucus that shouldn't be raising revenue in this way. And so the main thing that one of the main ideas that committee had to generate revenue, in other words, to not have to cut other things, isn't totally popular with many of their colleagues. The same thing happened with the Government and Oversight Committee, which had a lot of changes for federal employees in there in terms of paying more for healthcare or retirement and in overall, changing their benefits package so that the employee pays a lot more. And interestingly, there were some conservative members who objected to that in that committee because, as they said, well, this was a promise we made, and they aren't making a huge salary, so it's deferred compensation is important, which was interesting to hear. So just as we go through this process, some of the ideas that the committees have developed themselves may or may not be universally supported by even the members of their own caucus. And we're starting to see some of those things. There was also surprise in the Judiciary Committee. The Judiciary Committee had the ability to increase spending. And what we're starting to see is that there are, once a legislative body sees that there is a bill that really is moving along through a process and is on the track to be passed and become law, sometimes what happens is there's more and more of an effort to put as many ideas into that bill that is moving or has to pass as possible. And that seems to be what happened here, that the Judiciary Committee included a provision that would essentially allow the repeal of the administration to just remove existing federal regulations. And it would also require that any federal regulation that exists would have to be approved by Congress in order for it to continue to exist within 5 years. Administrative rules are the thing that tells the real details about how a law passed by Congress is supposed to work. So Congress will often pass legislation and then say to a federal agency, now it's your job to figure out how to do this policy that we have passed. And sometimes federal agencies say, well, we can see what your plan is in the statute, but there's a lot of details that aren't in the statute, and we have to figure out how do you actually do it in the real world, because we have, say, lots of businesses or consumers or different interests that really need some certainty. They need to know how to operate. They need to have some sort of structure that remains the same in order to know what to do. And oftentimes that means the federal agencies are promulgating, that's the fancy word for making, administrative rules that really flesh out those details. There are a lot of administrative rules. Sometimes they're revised because sometimes the world around us changes or the laws change. So rules are not, they don't stay the same forever. And there are a lot of them. There are more than 95,000 federal administrative rules. 943 in the Centers for Medicaid Services alone. And they talk about, they flesh out the details and the requirements for all sorts of things. So say, for example, what do you need to care for a patient? Or what do states have to do for billing practices? What are the minimum requirements? What are the things that are flexible? All sorts of stuff that's really important in terms of everyday operation of business are contained in these rules. And so when you have a policy that now says, well, you can just remove whichever ones you don't like, and Congress gets to kind of say which ones remain in effect, that could mean that you might be getting rid of a regulation that could be important. And maybe people wouldn't know about it before it happens. So what's left in terms of the committees in the House that have to decide what cuts they want to make? We were supposed to see both the Medicaid and SNAP committees go next week. Everything has been shifted to a week after that. And there's a number of reasons why. First of all, the members of the committee and Congress in general can't seem to agree on what they want to do in terms of cuts to Medicaid and SNAP. They also are adding on more and more things to this bill that they'd like it to do. So that becomes another pressure point of how do you work and make the cuts that you agreed to do while you're adding more things that either make policy changes or result in less revenue. A main factor is public pressure. Constituents are watching what they're doing, especially on Medicaid and especially on SNAP. And they are really smart and engaged. You are some of those smart and engaged people. And they understand now, because this has gone for quite a long time, that a lot about the different ideas that Congress is proposing and what they might mean for states, for people who rely on Medicaid for health and long-term care, for small businesses, for the whole healthcare sector. So there's a lot of attention going on to what are these ideas that you think that you're going to do and the impact of them. There's also been some polling released that is showing that a lot of folks in the country are not as happy with how Congress and the administration is doing things right now. And sometimes that makes a difference. You know, if people continue to not like things or like it less, then does that make it easier to make certain changes or harder to make certain changes? There are also a number of folks who are watching, when will people start to really see and feel the impacts of tariffs policy, and will that make a difference to opinion? And so the longer that we have a delay, the more likely it is that some of these things become clearer and they may influence what the actual proposals are. So energy and commerce, they've been instructed to cut at least 880 billion from Medicaid, primarily. On Wednesday, all the national advocates were like, May 7th is the day. This is when the Energy and Commerce Committee is going to do its markup on Medicaid. People were rearranging their lives to be free on Sunday night and Monday night because they were expecting that piece of legislation to drop, and we were all going to sit there and read through it and figure out what was in it. They went so far to have a lot of planned events next week to try and really keep the focus on Medicaid cuts. And then last night, the Energy and Commerce Committee said it wouldn't meet as planned, which means that they do not have agreement on Medicaid cuts despite several weeks of intense meetings, not only with their own members on the committee and with the greater Republican House leadership, but with the White House as well. So we talked a little bit about, there was a letter that 12 members in the Republican Party said, hey, we need to send out a flag that we don't want to do Medicaid cuts that we think are going to hurt people's benefits. And we talked a little bit about how there's some language in there that isn't quite, doesn't quite mean they want to protect Medicaid. And it may not mean that they don't want to do some cuts, but it was nonetheless a gesture that those 12 members felt they had to make, largely because they kept getting public pressure about Medicaid and had to send some signal to constituents that they were listening. Well, this week, a group of 19 Republicans released a separate letter that said we do need to make structural changes to Medicaid in order from a fiscal conservative perspective. So, we have now dueling letters where we have 12 people saying we don't want to make cuts to Medicaid that we think are going to impact individual people's benefits, and 19 members who are now feeling like they have to say to their colleagues, yeah, you do. You have to make big changes to Medicaid because this is the place that matters if you're serious about cutting deficits and really changing the direction of where we're going. Lots of discussion behind the scenes about how deep to cut Medicaid. Lots of members trying behind the scenes to say, well, I'll go this far, but here's my red line. I won't do anything beyond this. All of that is a good sign for advocates that nothing is set in stone, and there are certainly people who are willing to do less deep cuts than not. None of that means that any of the members of the House won't vote for the final product, but still is causing delay, and it's a good signal for us that our advocacy has been effective. So what kind of cuts are still being really talked about? Really, the entire menu of cuts that we've been talking about since January is on the table, but there is some agreement about certain cuts that keeps coming up over and over again. So when people start talking about the same ideas and that's consistent over time, begin to understand that there is more support for those ideas. Unfortunately, one of the things that is supported is the idea of adding paperwork requirements to people who qualify for Medicaid. And that is both in the realm of more frequent eligibility checks and also the idea of putting in an administrative requirement, and whether it's a requirement for all states or an option, and how much the federal government decides who those requirements do and don't belong to. Those are some of the details on the edges, but the overall idea of we should tie somebody's ability to access healthcare coverage to whether or not they are working does seem to be coming up over and over again. And a number of we've been talking about them as prove your working requirements, which is still accurate, right? Most people in Medicaid are working, and if they're not, there's a very good reason why. And for those folks, who are already in Medicaid and working, we're adding extra paperwork for them. But there's another factor here, which is people who are already working sometimes lose their jobs. And so some advocates have been saying this is actually a job loss penalty, because for a lot of people in Medicaid who lose their jobs, they lose their health care if they lose their job. They don't have a COBRA option where you can pay money you don't have to keep your health insurance. Medicaid is their health insurance. So a job loss penalty, really, tying healthcare coverage to your work status means that if you lose your work status, you lose your health care. And in the case of Medicaid, it happens to be that these are already very low income people who can't afford to buy health care on the private insurance market, because that's why they're in Medicaid. So there's kind of a couple of different implications to that. But it seems to be an idea that there is real support for. So we've got to watch for it. There's also a lot of support for changing how states can use different sorts of revenue as to count for their state required match. That seems to come up quite often. It seems to come up quite often to reduce the amount of federal money going to states to operate their Medicaid programs. That's the federal Medicaid administrative match. One of the ideas that our state Department of Health Services actually did a projection on. And then there's a real per capita caps question happening. At the moment, they seem to be thinking about having a per capita cap that applies to the Medicaid expansion population. Again, those people who were allowed to be in Medicaid as low-income working adults under the Affordable Care Act. Wisconsin didn't take the Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act, but we do actually cover childless adults in our programs. We do have people who are able-bodied, low-income workers in Medicaid. And the idea that's being talked about is to apply that cap to the Medicaid expansion population in the 41 states that have expanded Medicaid, which would essentially mean that states do not have a lot of money to make up. And for a lot of states, it might mean that they stop covering the expansion population because the amount of money that they get per person just simply isn't enough to cover the actual costs of care. We're still watching for other laws and policy changes that those kind of keep bubbling up and different ideas keep recycling. The main point here is everything that you've heard about since January is still on the table in some form or another. Sometimes the original idea may change a little bit, maybe the ingredients of the recipe change, but the overall dish doesn't. So these are the places where Congress keeps circling around and around and keeps having disagreements on the details. They aren't saying no cuts, and they aren't, but they are worried about, whether people understand those ideas to mean Medicaid cuts and what consequences that would have in terms of the public's perception. So how do you hide cuts? If you want to make cuts, but you don't want people to know that they're cuts or believe that they're cuts, there are some strategies, and these are some of the things that Congress is considering. They're thinking about how can we stretch the cut over time or delay when it goes into effect so people will forget by the time we've passed the bill and by the time the cut goes into effect, who's responsible for making the cut. That's a strategy that that lawmakers sometimes use, and it's being discussed now. Some lawmakers are discussing, well, maybe we, instead of us making the cut and taking responsibility for it, maybe we'll tell the Federal Department of Health and Human Services to figure out how to do it. That again, that idea of Congress will set some broad language, and then the actual details of what states need to do and how they have to cut will be done by somebody else. Again, it's putting time and space and distance from the body that decided cuts are necessary, which is Congress, and then who ends up having to make the hard decisions, which is states, and putting the federal agency in the middle as kind of the person who gets to interpret what Congress wants and tell states what they have to do. There are also some changes that they're thinking seriously about that increase the cost to states at the same time that Medicaid funding is reduced. One of the things that you see in the our Department of Health Services estimate of, say, the work requirements piece, what you're seeing there is the idea of how much more would it cost us to do the same amount of work if we had less money from the federal government to help us do that. The other piece of that, however, is if you have more work to do and you don't get that extra money to do it, then you have more work with the same amount of people and less funding. That often leads to a less efficient program and maybe you not being able to complete all the work you're supposed to be doing, with real consequences for people who have delays in getting into Medicaid, or when mistakes happen and they get kicked off, or other things. You kind of are reducing the amount of federal money to help states do a good job. At the same time, you're reducing money for the program, and you end up having more, increasing the amount of work that has to be done by the same amount of people with less money. Usually a recipe for things not working as well. There also may be some other changes that are really impactful that change who can get into Medicaid or what level of poverty you have to be in to qualify. And that may or may not be in the Energy and Commerce Committee. Those are all tricks that Congress can use to kind of hide what the impact is. The Congressional Budget Office does put out assessments of what each idea is. They kind of, it's called a score. So they will, each idea that is proposed gets a score of how much money does it save over 10 years. And for the ideas about more frequent eligibility checks, or what does it mean if you put in extra requirements for people to prove that they're working to keep their health care, we understand that they will be making an assessment of how much money that will save. That is really about how many people lose their coverage. That's how you get the savings from those ideas, as well as an estimate of how many people will lose their coverage. So pretty soon, once we get those committee ideas out and those the independent body that does the scoring for Congress does their assessments, we're going to have a much better understanding of what the impact is. The Agriculture Committee, again, was supposed to go next week. Lots and lots of disagreement on how to reduce the the federal SNAP spending. For many people who are in Medicaid, they are probably also in SNAP. So we are watching for changes to work requirements there. Also changes that would take away flexibility for states to extend SNAP to, other people, or waive requirements for people. And more importantly, what's discussed this week is cost shifting SNAP to states. So right now, food assistance is 100% federally funded. And there's been an idea to kind of like how Medicaid and DVR and other programs have worked, to say, well, maybe we as the federal government shouldn't pay 100%. Maybe we should require states to put in part of the money before we give them any federal money. So a more of a matching relationship, which is how Medicaid works. Remember, we have 60% of our federal dollars are coming into the state to support Medicaid, and then the state adds in another 40%. Same type of relationship here, but it's a very new idea for food assistance. And what it would mean is states don't have to pay anything now. So if they start having to pay something, that means that they need to find money to do that, or the money they get from the federal government for food assistance goes down. This has been an idea that's gone back and forth. So on Wednesday, the White House said it didn't support that. But by Thursday evening, the same White House said, yeah, we'll do that. It's okay for Congress to think about that idea of making states pay something in order to get federal funding, and maybe up to 25% is a fine target. That would be a big funding cut for states. They would have to find the money to do that. In the same context that they might be losing federal funding from other programs, not including Medicaid. So that is the big sticking point in the Agriculture Committee, is how do we get to $230 billion in cuts in that committee? And how do we do that through cutting food assistance? Much like the Judiciary Committee, there are also a lot of members who are trying to pack in legislative language for other things they want to do, because I think there is some recognition that maybe this reconciliation bill, might be about the only thing that Congress does. So we have this committee who's trying to find cuts at the same time they're adding other things, which is increasing the pressure to find more cuts. Ways and Means was not supposed to move next week. That was still on the horizon, and it was supposed to move the week of May 12th. Now it looks like Energy and Commerce and Agriculture and Ways and Means might move all in the same week. And there's some indication that there may be a strategy to do it all in the same day, with the thought that then maybe people couldn't pay attention to any one set of cuts, because all of the committees that have cuts would be happening at once. So again, things to watch in the Ways and Means Committee. This is the committee that has to figure out the tax pieces. Not only the extension of the 2017 tax cuts, but also the new things that the president has asked them to do. And now a group of Congress people has added another high cost things to how to deal with state and local taxes. So this committee has a lot of pressure, even though it has the ability to increase spending by $4.5 trillion. That $4.5 trillion was really about the 2017 tax cuts. And there's definitely more things that have been added to that price tag now. So they do cover other things in that committee. And certainly there are some advocates that are concerned that maybe tweaking some of the other things that that committee does could result in some offsets that would help them pay for the increased taxes. Okay, so here we are. We now have another week to prepare for rapid response. We thought we were going to be in this position next week, but now we have a little breathing room. We know what's coming. We know what the ideas are. We haven't seen the exact details, but it's important to be prepared and ready to go because these things are coming. Whether it is, the week after next, or if we're successful, we keep getting a delay. So if we're successful, we keep seeing this same slide for the next 3 weeks, right? And the more delay there is, it means the more disagreement there is. And the more disagreement there is, it means that it's harder, it becomes harder and harder for Congress to figure out what is the thing that we do that is acceptable to our constituents. So this is a time where you can get prepared. You can get your stuff prepared in advance if you want. You can start making calls to people who maybe haven't gotten engaged. If you are a small business or a disability group who hasn't been doing as much communication on these issues, now you have a little bit of time to reach out and have personal connections and conversations and kind of get a strategy together about how to move forward when it's necessary. Because it will be. It's just not next week. And it's really important for us to respond because the Senate is watching what people are saying. Earlier this week, there were some advocates who were worried that the US Senate might just take up and agree with whatever the US House passed. That seems to be a little less likely now. And we want to reinforce that the Senate does not want to just agree with what the House does, that the Senate maybe should have an interest in making a different plan than the House. Again, if the Senate just agrees to what the House does, it means then the bill has passed and been agreed upon and can be signed into law by the president. So then the president becomes the place where you have to focus your advocacy. But if the Senate says, some of these ideas that the House has put in here, we don't think should be in the final bill. We're going to edit this, or we're going to create our own bill and do it to say, here's our proposal, House. You can either agree to that or we need to negotiate. Again, that buys a lot of time for advocates to keep making the case on what are ideas that do not belong in a reconciliation bill. Okay. So it's important when you do rapidly respond that you're making sure to include our US senators too, because they need to know what you think about the House's ideas. And if you don't think that they're good ideas, it's a message to the Senate to not start there and or just agree to what the House is saying. There are federal folks this week who are exhausted, by the way, as I'm sure many of you out there are. They had a nice way of saying, like, okay, we're running a marathon and this is a 3-week sprint. And if we're successful at the end of that 3-week sprint, that means we probably get to sprint for another 3 weeks. So understand that we're in this place where things are going to be moving and changing rapidly. And that's actually a good sign. it would be a bad sign if things just happened and got passed and there was no opportunity to kind of say, hey, I don't think that's a good idea. All of this ability to have activity and kind of do a lot of work means that the work is mattering. It means that it's being influential, because if this were easy, it would already be done. And our job as advocates is to make this as difficult and as drawn out as possible, so that Congress understands that their constituents are watching and there may be consequences based on what they choose to do. All right, so that was reconciliation. Couple other things. The president's budget for next year is anticipated to come out. In fact, the skinny budget, I think I may have just seen a link across my phone, is supposed to be arrived today. Well, next slide will talk about that. And so we're going to get a pretty good picture of what things the president sees as priorities to fund and what things they don't see as priorities or maybe see as being okay to cut. This was an article that was published earlier this week, and I included it because it was very clear that a lot of the anti-poverty programs, many of which people with disabilities may participate in, including housing and those types of things, including disability and aging, organization whose job it is to kind of know what people with disabilities and older adults are facing and recommend ways to make things better for them. A lot of those proposals are probably going to be in this budget. And so when you think about this budget, think of it as a statement of intent. It is basically a signal to Congress that here are the things that this administration would support you doing. And some of those things might be cuts to programs that are really important to people with disabilities or low-income people in general. So there's a lot of things to look at in this document that really do give an idea of what things are important or not important. And certainly the president is saying, well, if you do these things, I've already said that they're my ideas. So, it's a sign to Congress that you can agree with what I've proposed, right? So the skinny version of the budget, it's a weird term, is basically not the full document, but it sets kind of overall overall, where do I think major targets of spending should be. And Congress is kind of really getting antsy about this, because in the middle of reconciliation for the 2025 year, they are also starting to think about, well, what are we going to spend money on in 2026? And remember, the federal fiscal year ends as of September 30th. So remember when we were fighting in March about a continuing resolution? That was about keeping the government open. So this work of what are we going to spend our money on in 2026 is really about keeping the government open again. It's going to be a repeat of the same crisis point we had in March 14th, where Congress really wants to get started. They have 12 appropriation bills that they're supposed to pass in order to get to the place where they have a budget for next year. Congress has not been good about doing that, and not been good about doing that on time. But the beginning point of that process is the president's executive budget proposal, and then Congress kind of takes it and edits it from there. We think we'll see the full document by the end of the month, which may be deliberate, right? Because the House is certainly saying we want to have passed a reconciliation package by the middle of the month. It may be that the rescissions bill that we've talked about before might get kind of wrapped up into this 2026 president's budget proposal, or it could still be separate. And it's interesting to me that Congress wants to review the spending cuts before they're publicly released. Once they're publicly released, then people can start talking about what they do and don't like. And so I think that there's a little bit of Congress trying to kind of edit or behind the scenes say, maybe don't put this in print because they don't sometimes you don't want to have pick your arguments that you want to have in public is not a bad strategy if you're a member of Congress. If there's a rescissions bill, there is a time limit. Congress has to pass it within 45 days. So some of the delay that we've been seeing may be because they understand that once you trigger the bill, you've introduced it, you're triggering a 45-day window to do something about it. All right, moving on to the last piece. So there's been a lot of discussion about DOGE. DOGE is still working in a lot of different agencies. There was just an article published this week that's specific to the aging and disability services cuts that were proposed, maybe as part of DOGE, and that of course includes this organization, Disability Rights Wisconsin, the Wiseman Center, many of our Board of Aging and Long-Term Care, many of our aging partners. Everything that was in the administration of community living is kind of the administration for community living, which consolidated and created efficiency amongst aging and disability advocacy groups, is being eliminated. And it is unclear what the plan is. DOGE continues to work through different federal agencies. All of the things that we've been talking about in previous weeks, none of them have ceased to happen that we're aware. It's just we keep adding on new information about additional things that are happening as part of this kind of extra governmental group. In terms of the Administration for Community Living, that issue of what are you doing to aging and disability organizations has been getting a lot of attention from Congress. So there's both a letter in the House and the Senate and rumors of potentially a hearing this month that would ask the Secretary of Health and Human Services to answer some questions Congress has about why are you doing this? What's this plan? What is the purpose of making these changes? Meanwhile, however, there are a number of organizations across the country that have not received any funding from the continuing resolution that was passed on March 14th, including ours. And some organizations run on a much tighter time frame where they are actually using the money that they're getting from the federal government in almost real time to pay their employees. And so now that we've had some distance between March 14th and May 2nd, there are at least two, and will probably be more, protection and advocacy organizations across the country that have said, hey, we can't take new cases because we can't guarantee that we have the funding to be in operation by the time that case moves through the system. So we're starting to see, the delay in appropriating money that Congress has already said should be allocated, having an impact on the operations and continuation of some of those programs and services. And it's not only aging and disability groups, this is across the board. The other thing that came to light this week is the U.S. Department of Justice has a civil rights division, and they actually have a disability division within that Office of Civil Rights. Since I think 1954, since the Eisenhower administration, their work has been pretty consistent, and it's been relatively unchanged, even as different presidents have come in and out of the office. But it seems to be different this time. The traditional work that the Office of Civil Rights does has been really focused on various kinds of discrimination. It's been focused on upholding ability for people to cast a vote, a lot of housing discrimination, employment, and a lot of disability specific discrimination cases, not only under ADA, but also under other federal disability laws. And it appears that this incoming administration has really changed what the mission statements for what the priorities are for the Office of Civil Rights Division to do. And it is not the same as all of the work that they have consistently done. A lot of the people who were in charge of these various divisions have been reassigned elsewhere, so they're no longer in their positions, and more than half have already left or are leaving or will have or already left the agency. So that's a pretty significant kind of mass leaving of experienced US DOJ attorneys who have expertise in just, doing these kinds of cases, because they see that they are not going to be doing the same kind of work that they have been. The other thing that has happened is that apparently the Office of Civil Rights Division has withdrawn for some ongoing cases, including some voting rights cases that are challenging whether or not I think a state has been right in trying to change their voting laws in a way that may mean that fewer people will get to vote. In terms of education, the last several weeks, we talked about this letter that was sent to all states that required states to certify that they weren't using any federal funds for any DEI related things. Wisconsin said, hey, we are already in compliance with all of the federal laws, and we have a bunch of questions for you, U.S. Department of Education, about what you're really asking for, because we're kind of worried that you want us to sign a certification just so you can say we're out of compliance and not give us federal money. 18 states did not sign the certification, including Wisconsin, and now that has moved into a lawsuit from all of those states to say, hey, you should not be using a certification letter as a mechanism to stop sending money to states. Yesterday, the U.S. Department of Education canceled about $1 billion worth of federal mental health grants. Some of that money came to Wisconsin. Our friends at the Department of Public Instruction are aware of this. They got the letter apparently yesterday, so that they are planning to update at some point their federal funding impact site to kind of let us know like how much of that $1 billion that was awarded in federal health grants went to Wisconsin. And the reason that the department canceled those grants was because of a perception that somehow those grants were in conflict with DEI related policies that have been put in place. In an article this morning, we keep adding on to the pile of things that are happening, but now the consequences of some of the things that we talked about earlier in March, for example, early in March 10th, the U.S. Department of Education started reducing their staff. They have fired or laid off about 46% of the staff that worked at the U.S. Department of Education, and a good portion of those staff worked in their Office of Civil Rights, which takes on discrimination and especially cases that involve IDEA. About half of the cases that office dealt with were for students with disabilities. So in March, a good portion of the people that worked in that office and on those kinds of cases were laid off. And by April, we were talking about some news coverage saying that the amount of staff that they had lost meant that investigating those certain kinds of cases, discrimination cases in school, was not doable anymore. Today, a new article is coming out that very similar to what we just talked about with the US DOJ Office of Civil Rights, it seems like there is a shift from the priorities, what kinds of cases have traditionally been done by that agency, and there's a shift to a very different type of case that is the focus here. So the traditional priorities of the U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights have been discrimination cases in schools, enforcing IDEA and the rights of students with disabilities. Now it seems the priorities have shifted to be far more focused on transgender students and making sure that schools are not doing what is termed DEI efforts. So there are lawsuits that are going on, but again, this is an example of how something that happened in March is now evolving into a different issue, but the original cause of losing a whole bunch of staff happened 2 months ago, and now we're starting to see different effects. Okay, so we have a little more time this week, right? Because we're not going to be expecting that the Energy and Commerce and unless you get an actual alert from me on Sunday, but I think Congress is serious that they don't have enough agreement to do those markups next week. So this is a good opportunity to kind of connect with folks that you may not have been able to connect with in a while. We've been hearing from some folks that they are wondering where their local disability organizations are on this, that they perhaps haven't been seeing any calls to action or don't know what their local disability, whether that's a disability specific organization or a chapter group, what they've been doing on Medicaid and some of these other issues. It is possible that maybe local groups have been doing stuff, but there's so much information out there that you haven't seen it. But it is time to kind of maybe make some personal calls to folks that you know, especially if you haven't been seeing a group that you think should have a real interest, especially in Medicaid cuts. If you haven't been seeing a very public presence on what they're doing, I think it's appropriate to ask, why, and find out what they have been doing. And if they haven't been engaged yet, there's still a lot of time to do that. And the time is now. And you may want to even make sure that you make it easy for them. If they have a newsletter, that's an easy way for them to get out information. If they have social media and they want to do social media posts, but they don't quite know what to post, there's a way that we can connect folks with content if that's the barrier. There's absolutely no advantage to waiting on the sidelines at this point. I think that we're in a place where adding and increasing the number of voices that are talking about what these ideas might do to real people in the state is going to be increasingly important. So again, it's not only local disability groups. If you have local small businesses, maybe folks or professional groups that have been maybe sitting and waiting and wondering what's happening or whether they should act, the answer to whether they should act is yes. And the answer to when they should do it is now. If they haven't done it before, there's still now and what they can do in the future. That's what you can control. And certainly you can be kind of the cheerleader that helps figure out like what have folks been doing, what's been working, what are some ideas that you have that you've been using, and help get that word out and get more and more people watching and engaged. We're going to have a lot of opportunity to influence how this goes. So many of you, we talked last week about sending personal letters as a strategy to make sure that our friends in Congress in DC see the faces and see the handwriting of the people who are concerned about these cuts and what it will mean to them. Now you got an extra week to do it. We know that there are going to be markup hearings. So the inflection point next week is make sure that your face is in their office, right? The next thing is reacting to when that committee shows its plan, react immediately And there are going to be a whole bunch of advocates. They're going to be reading that legislative language who are going to say, here is what we see as an initial thing. Don't wait for the final analysis of every detail. You can respond right away and say, hey, I'm a constituent and I see these are the big picture things. I'm going to be reading more of the details and I will probably have further opinions for you. But right now, I want you to know what my initial reaction is. Everybody can do that part. Everybody can do a social media post to kind of elevate in real time. Here's what we see and why we don't think it's a good idea. If you're part of an organization or a business, you can put out a press release. There's a lot of power in many, many groups putting out even a short 3 to 4 line reaction statement at the same time that says, hey, this is not good. This is going to impact us in these ways. We're reading the bill further. We're going to have more opinions once we know the details, but we just want to show you that our initial reaction and response to this is this. That's a really effective strategy because when the media sees that there are 200 groups that are all saying from very different perspectives that there's an idea that isn't going to work out well for them, that's another way to get coverage of it and as a continuing story. Even after the House Markup Committee meetings happen, and we're going to have a little time to do more of a deep dive of what are the ideas and what do they mean, so you can amplify that. We have to keep up the pressure on all of the federal lawmakers until the House votes. And again, we don't know when the House is going to vote. So if we're successful, we're going to put more time between when the markup committee happens and when the House votes. And that more time is going to be an opportunity to keep up the pressure and keep talking about like, hey, we've been reading more details and we keep finding more things that we think are going to impact folks. When the House votes, you react to the House vote. And after the House votes, they're probably coming home for recess. So start thinking about your plans. When lawmakers return, they technically are have an in-district day May 23rd through, but there's a Memorial Day recess that's about a little less than a week long. And that's another great time to, again, revisit them when they're in district. And hopefully you'll have a lot of things to say because we will have seen what their plans are. And maybe they will have already voted on it. And you could talk to them about what they voted on and whether or not you support what they did. Always, here's a list of things that everybody can always do. There's going to be a flood more of various types of studies and other things. If you're a poster of, like what would work requirements mean for Wisconsin, I can tell you that there are national groups that are crunching numbers and doing things, and there will be more content that you can use to populate all of your stuff. A lot of these things you've already been doing, but continue to do it, and more importantly, get other people who haven't been as engaged to do some of those things. For every person who does 5 things a day, if there's 5 other people who are willing to do 1 thing a day, then you get 6 more impressions that are about Medicaid. So it's really important not to have people like devote their entire lives to this, but to have everybody devote part of what their day is to this. And that can really amplify not only the message, but just the sheer number of people who are watching. So we're going to close this week's webinar. There's still time to make a real difference, and we are hoping to extend that time frame of action for as long as possible. We were not supposed to be here right now. This was supposed to be over and done by the end of February. It is now officially May. So you can congratulate yourself on all of the work that you have done already to get us to this point. And also know that some of the cracks are starting to emerge here, that the ideas that they were talking about in January, as a done deal are really still very much the subject of argument amongst members of the same party. So the moment is not in the future. It hasn't passed. It's now, and it's going to be now until we have reached a conclusion of the reconciliation bill. And I think that the more people we can have join at this point, the more we can use this time to increase the amount of voices that are talking about these issues, the more likely we're going to get to the end of this process with as little damage or no damage as possible. All right, I am going to stop now. And if there's any questions that folks haven't answered already, we can take them.